You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody, welcome back. In Minneapolis, Greg Bovino has just quickly concluded his press conference. I guess he didn't really want to about this gun, he says, Alex had. But it's, as I say, a big world. I'm joined now by Lisa Gaufman. She's joined us before. She is calling in from the Netherlands, where she is assistant professor of Russian discourse and politics at the University of Groningen. She and I first talked, oh my God, 4 years ago in the run-up to the Ukraine war, and we've been talking since. She is a really interesting scholar. And you know, she has ideas on power that aren't centered only on what leaders do, but it includes, you know, sort of the complex soup of the messages that members of society send to each other. So it's a perspective we need a whole lot more of right now when we have a guy who thinks he's king. Hello, Lisa. Thank you for joining me again.
Hi, Edwin. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'm a little distracted because we've had another government killing of a citizen on the streets in Minneapolis. I know you pay attention to what's going on here. Just appalling, and we're trying to make sense of it. But I want to understand what's going on over there a little bit. I mean, Donald Trump this last 10 days, let's see, he demanded Greenland. He announced he would take it by force. He announced punitive sanctions against any who would dare question that annexation. And then he failed and retreated. I mean, and there was never any question about the capability of the U.S. Army to occupy the island. But something Trump didn't expect, I think, proved more powerful. In the U.S., Americans mocked the idea, mocked it fiercely. And in Europe, allies raised both the cost of annexation and, I guess, ordinary Europeans used the idea to just talk about Trump as a madman. I mean, am I seeing that right? And, you know, what do you think was the power of the messages people were sending?
Well, I think that most Europeans have been looking at Trump as a madman since 2015, 2016. And you might be familiar with a book that's called Toddler in Chief. And that I think that kind of frame is also quite common among a lot of people who criticize Donald Trump in Europe. So this whole idea of toddler in chief, I think, is now getting even more traction now because of the kind of ridiculous demands that he's making and the kind of the way that some people are trying to pacify and assuage his concerns, let's put it this way. And when it comes to Greenland, I actually talked to some of my colleagues from Denmark, and some of them who also work in international relations and some defense advising and consulting, they were pretty incredulous already last year, because already last year in March, I remember talking to a colleague who was telling me that we spent years discussing what are our defense plans if Russia attacks us here in Denmark, and now we have to turn our cannons the other way towards America because this is where the more likely invasion is coming. So this was the kind of, well, they were incredulous about the fact that now they have to rethink their entire defense strategy in Denmark, because that's already last year in March. I remember they were talking about that there was a pretty credible threat of the U.S. invading Greenland. So, and it's obviously becoming even more acute now, and even the Netherlands sent 2 soldiers to Greenland. So this was actually a fact that was incessantly mocked here in the Netherlands, that we sent 2 soldiers to protect European interests. But then again, it's also there's another layer there, of course, because Greenland also has a history of colonization. Obviously, there was a lot of really awful things that the Danish government did to the indigenous population. So there was a lot of collective trauma there. And it's also layered with all these ideas about other great powers sort of deciding over the fate of the Greenlanders. I think this is something that is quite a painful subject for the people there, because their fate has been decided and they were ruled by other powers before. Mm-hmm. And I think that also raises a lot of conversations about the treatment of indigenous people in general, like how the great powers have treated indigenous populations. And even in Sweden, for example, there were also programs about sterilizing, let's say, Sami women, so another small indigenous group. So these conversations actually having a very unexpected consequences here in Europe, because a lot of those topics have been sort of hushed a little bit, like, somewhere at the back of the drawer somewhere, but now they're coming to the forefront because Greenland is on the agenda. But I think that overall...
that's interesting.
Yeah. And I think that overall, when the whole Greenland deal actually was announced, you're probably familiar with taco, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. The not the food, the other thing, yep. Right? So, and I think that I've seen a lot of people on social media making that joke actually, because when you actually recount the conditions for this supposedly new Greenland deal, it's essentially what it was before. I mean, the U.S. has always had access to Greenland because Denmark is an ally within the NATO. So what was the point in the first place? So that there's this
you study Russia. You spent a lot of time studying Russia. Could the point have been to open a Western front for Europe, to give more space and time to Putin in Ukraine? I mean, Donald Trump gets some credit for saying, Europe, you need to pay more attention and spend more money to help protect Europe. And you need to do more to push back, in Ukraine. But then when Europe started to do it, he then harassed Europe from the West.
Interesting that you mentioned that. Actually, the Russian media have been state media, because in Russia, the media are governmental controlled, as you know. So there was actually a lot of coverage of Greenland, because the whole idea of the U.S. Getting or occupying, annexing Greenland is something that is very understandable for the Russian government. So Putin would be actually quite happy if the U.S. actually annexed Greenland, because this is something that he did. I mean, he annexed Crimea. So, and that for him, this is kind of the logic of the great powers. So, and this also works in the kind of national security strategy that the U.S. has now. So it's the kind of the Monroe Doctrine, Trump 2.0. So because you have the same idea of, okay, the U.S. can do whatever it wants in its hemisphere, and then Russia can do whatever it wants in its hemisphere. And that's why the whole Greenland topic has been very popular on the Russian state media, because that provides extra justification for the Russian government for its conduct in Ukraine, essentially. Because if the U.S. this is just what great powers do, and that's okay. So that's why it was actually covered quite extensively in the Russian media. So, and then when it comes to defense spending, I think a lot of European countries are interpreting it in its own way. So, for example, in the Netherlands, some of this defense spending is also directed towards the education. So we're supposed to now, like at our university, for example, some students might be able to take a military minor, so they can enlist in the Dutch army as the minor. So it's like there are different ways of interpreting this whole defense spending issue, and some countries are actually directing it into infrastructure spending. So so it's again, you can creatively approach the whole idea of extra defense spending that might not even actually go into, let's say, I don't know, new tanks or weapons or something.
That's true here too. That's always true. You have a point of view about power, if I understand your writing, and I probably don't, but that the identity of a population, their view of themselves, creates either limitations or affordances on that rulers, on what they can get away with. So how Putin feeds the Russians about what Russian identity is gives him more or less freedom to act in Ukraine. And I wonder if I'm right about that, what you think about what Donald Trump and his propaganda are trying to do here in the U.S.
Well, it's always difficult to apply theories into to empirical cases, especially even though I would say that America and Russia are actually quite similar in many ways. And I remember, I think it was maybe 2014, where the Daily Show correspondent went to Russia and said that Russia was the ultimate red state because the taxes were low and people love guns and stuff like that. So they were kind of making a very hyperbolic argument about it. But what I would say is that when you live in an authoritarian country, and I think that I'm afraid that the United States is really moving fast towards an authoritarian country structure. I think that there's a lot of people forget that the propaganda does not necessarily work in a unidirectional way. So when you're exposed to propaganda all the time, obviously it has an effect. But also what it does is that people actually try to carve out some spaces and spaces of ambiguity when they actually start pushing back against it. So it might not actually even look like outward resistance, but it might still be something that contests the authoritarian power that is there. So like even I don't know, even like filming an ICE agent slipping and falling and making fun of that, that's already resistance. You know, I know yes, it might not look like much in a grand scheme of things, but this is
no, we celebrate it as resistance.
Well, yes, that's also kind of the point that I make in the book, is that there are sometimes very small acts of resistance, and that's in an authoritarian context, very often it's only the small acts that you can afford. So in Russia, for example, there's such a thing as it's called semiotic guerrilla, when you actually write things on the walls, like the little graffiti. Sometimes they're very small, but then what it does actually, it helps people see that they're not alone if they're against the government, if they're against the governmental policy. Because, and there are some of those inscriptions, I even say something like, for this inscription, I will get 15 years of prison, because everybody knows what you are actually writing there. And obviously in the US, like we have so many guns there. It's just such a dangerous place in many ways. And this is also something that obviously the first sign of it, like the way that resistance is codified in the United States is through guns, right? The Second Amendment and militia and everything. So, and that's how most people actually think about it. But I think that what is also a very important part of resistance is solidarity. When you actually, I've also been in touch with some of my colleagues in the U.S. who have been shuttling their friends' kids to school to make sure that they don't get stopped by ICE and stuff. So this kind of acts of solidarity, I think this is any authoritarian regime's kryptonite, honestly, because this is how you actually hold the community together, and this is how you protect the community. And I think that's what the administration, the Trump administration, didn't expect was this solidarity that people have displayed and practiced towards their neighbors.
We learned it in my city in Chicago when they attacked here first. I want to push back a little bit on your. I think you're completely correct that guns and resistance are entwined in the American ethos, but so is the history of the civil rights movement in America, the suffrage movement in America, the labor movement in America, where all of our progress happened, and it happened because of peaceful protest and not because of violent protest, even though there was violence associated with the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, all the sit-ins that just like occupying spaces that are not that were not meant for you, or even protecting your neighbors from the raids or something. This is something that is extremely important. I mean, in Munich, for example, there is this monument that it's called Viscardi Gasse. It's like a little side street that is behind the place where there used to be a monument for the beer putsch in Munich. And so during the Nazi Germany time, if you were passing by that monument, you had to do a Nazi salute, what Elon Musk does, right?
Yep.
And so a lot of people were actually, in order not to do that Hitler salute in front of that monument, they would actually turn into the small street to avoid doing that. And at some point, the Nazis noticed that that's what people were doing, so they actually stationed several police officers to make sure that the people who are turning into that street are there on business and not just avoiding their patriotic duty of doing the Hitler salute. And so a lot of people who actually turned into that street actually ended up in Dachau in the concentration camp. So even that kind of thing, just not saluting, not giving a Hitler salute was already resisted. There's a small monument for the people who did that in Nazi Germany, because even in Nazi Germany, you could still do something. So I think that in the context, obviously that was peaceful, that was not violent, and people probably could not have been afforded any violence in that regard, or counteract with violence, what I'm saying.
So you pay attention to how societies talk to themselves in a lot of your work. Here in the United States, what the reaction to Donald Trump and to the consolidation of government propaganda has been, it is divided. Two things are happening. A large majority of the country, large and growing majority of the country, hates what they see. They absolutely despise what they're seeing on the streets of Minneapolis, as they hated what they see in Chicago. They think the foreign adventurism is crazy, and they just want the price of goods to come down. I mean, they just really don't like it. A small group, and by small in the United States is not ever very small, 20%, maybe 25% of Americans, big group, however, are becoming even more radicalized, more ready to find justification for political and racial violence towards the very existence of people who they've been encouraged to hate. What happens when you have this kind of dynamic? Think of it as somewhere between 70-30 and 80-20, but one side is really radicalized and ready to engage in political violence. Well, at least ready to, I don't know, the president is ready to pardon them for political violence. And the other side... He already did
pardon a lot of people for political violence, specifically.
He did.
And then again, those people actually turned around and engaged in more violence, as you know.
Political violence, yes, when they worked for ICE.
Yeah. And I mean, especially if you have this kind of a very violent authoritarian government in power, obviously it's cheaper in many ways and safer to be a part of that government. That's why there are a lot of, let's say, women who are talking about how they hate feminism and they just want to be traditional wives. Obviously, they can if they want to, but then they also say that feminism is something for, it's a stupid idea. But obviously, there have benefited from feminist ideas, but in a patriarchal society, it's much easier and more beneficial for them to be a part of patriarchy, because that's what would, they think will save them. But that's, I think, the kind of dynamic that we can see, that some people have been apologists for Trump and his, racist policies. They have now, especially people of color who have defended some of those policies or embraced white supremacy, even like Vivek Ramaswamy, for example. He is now actually hitting the limits of how this type of white supremacist ideology will never embrace him as a person of color. And I've seen some.
He's running for governor in Ohio, in a state that, yes, and he is running against a very good friend of mine, and the Republican control of Ohio may melt because Vivek is a terrible candidate, and he has the problems that you are describing.
Yeah, because he has been in service of white supremacy and the Trump ideology, but now he actually realizes that that same ideology will never embrace him because they're too racist to embrace him, even with all his conservative proclamations and everything that he has said. And kind of the same applies to J.D. Vance as well. I mean, he's essentially openly insulted his wife for being Hindu and talked about how he hopes for her to become a Christian. So it's insulting. And then, but in the sense, he is correct that the MAGA movement will never embrace her as a Hindu. Or as a woman of color in the first place, and that's also what makes it very. I mean, it's a very black irony, but it's kind of a very sad irony that a lot of people who think that those kind of far right movements will protect them because they have served this far right movement, they will be eventually eaten up by this far right movement because they will not qualify to be a part of it in the end because of this radicalization that is happening. And as you also know, that a lot of people would privately say, oh, well, I don't support this, but then if I say that openly, I will get death threats. So this is something that I think a lot of Republican senators have said.
Yes, I have no patience for them. Americans have shown, and they showed today in Minnesota. I mean, they killed Renee Good last week in Minnesota, and they said to protesters, didn't you learn your lesson? So they said, we'll kill you again, and yet protesters showed up again. Americans are not eager to die for our democracy, but we are willing to, and we're showing it in city after city. And that, I think, is something that the right wing did not expect. Because frankly, our politicians on the left have not been willing to fight as hard as the ones on the right for decades, and yet the people in the street are willing to die for this cause. And I think that sends messages that are very powerful throughout society.
I think that what some of commentators here also notice that if I were like a political consultant, I would tell like Democratic leaders why aren't you there on the streets in Minnesota with the protesters? Like, show up. Like, they're actually fighting for your republic. Why aren't you there with them?
I think there's a good reason. I mean, in part because the Democratic brand has been hurt very badly, like the Republican one. Americans, by and large, and look, I'm a partisan, but Americans, by and large, are skeptical of political parties. And this particular fight is no longer between Democrats and Republicans. It's about, do we have a democracy we believe in, or don't we? And the person I was talking to right before you came on, Lisa, is from the School of Foreign Services at Georgetown University, also a remarkable scholar. And he said, look, great power conflict is not quite how you have to think about this. You have to think about it as sort of neo-royalist. These guys are trying to create rent-seeking behavior for the king, that just personally enrich those in power. And as opposed to build up the strength of their nations to engage in great power conflict, they're going to make everybody poorer so that a handful of people can be richer. And Americans, as we come to understand it that way, and I think Prime Minister Carney talked about it a little bit, these messages are seeping in around the propaganda, but the propaganda is very powerful here.
Yes, propaganda is powerful. And again, having studied Russia, propaganda does work to an extent. But what it also does, it makes people feel isolated, and it makes people feel like they're the only ones that disagree with it. And you still have free press in the U.S. Some of it is still there, right?
The truth can still be found. But you also have people showing up in vast numbers in cities.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's really that
in the country.
That should give you a lot of hope. I hope it gives you hope, because it's just it's incredible. As I said, I was blown away by the kind of solidarity that people have displayed towards the Somali American community, for example, and just like trying to protect their neighbors. And I think that's really important. And we had elections here in the Netherlands not too long ago. And when my son came from school, he also asked me like, also talked about the parties, and then we also have a far-right party here that lost the elections. I mean, it still had a lot of seats, but they lost. And my son's like, well, I don't understand why people would vote for this party. They want foreigners out, and we're foreigners. Why does he want us out of this country? So it's kind of like even kids talk about this thing.
Feel
they
it.
do. Yeah, they feel it. And if you have like a political leader, and in case of the U.S., president, vice president of the country, who spread absolutely well, horrendous slander about minorities in the U.S. and then talk about cats and dogs and stuff. Like, it's incredible. And then again, it comes down to the children, and children feel that kind of thing as well. They also feel like they might be unwelcome, that they might be, and then other people, they might get bullied. So this is something that has a very deep effect. And then for example, if somebody would insult somebody else, like, well, the president does it too, why can't I do that? So it's also about modeling a certain type of behavior,
well,
right?
Look, there is not a single person in this administration for anyone to admire. Not the president, not any member of Congress. I mean, I'm an old man, and not ever in my lifetime, no matter who the president has been, has there been an administration with no one to admire. No one. No one. Doug Burgum made a lot of money, was governor of a state. He's the Interior Secretary this week. It was just unacceptable in Independence National Park in Philadelphia, where they happened to have a few signs up that described the life of the 9 enslaved people who lived in George Washington's house. Oh, that shouldn't happen. He tore down the signs this week. Go on.
Yeah,
that sounds like Putin, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, Putin also has a lot of friends who he personally enriched, and that also the way he keeps his loyalty is also through the promises and the way that through money, essentially. The only way you can get personally rich is by being close to power, and that's also what's happening in the U.S. right now as well. I mean, you pay for the ballroom, you get a governmental contract or something like that, right? But that's been kind of the reality in Russia for a while now, and look where it got us. So I think that's the kind of the extent of kleptocracy, I think it's becoming a bit more obvious now for a lot of people in the U.S., even those who are not particularly interested in politics. So I think I'm hoping that it might also change some ideas about how the government is supposed to run, that the government might actually should not fire cancer researchers and hire some kind of 20-year-olds who, who get their money on the betting market or something like that. So,
well, our politics is changing. I can't see around the corner, but we have a different kind of politics coming. America's very dynamic. We are a country that changes very fast.
Yeah.
And given that we're this big, that's amazing. But I think about like the change in the thinking about gay marriage in this country and how fast that changed, right?
Yeah.
And it took a long time, but civil rights. We went from a nation that was the biggest enslaver of people to one that elected Barack Obama president. And then walked away from that. I mean, we just change so fast, and the way we do politics has to change with it, and it is changing. And it either is going to be made illegal, and we're going to do what the boss tells us, and he's going to get rich while we work for him, or it's going to be something else. And I just see in the streets in Minneapolis, where it's 20 below, and that's Fahrenheit, a real desire for and that's a white city mostly. This is, it's just saying, no, this is not who we want to be. And I saw it here in Chicago, and I'm seeing it all over the country. So it'll be a really interesting time. I think they've hit their high water mark, these fascists.
I hope so too. I don't think that they counted on this amount of resistance, honestly, because that the first tool of authoritarian is obviously intimidation and threat of violence. That usually works. And again, like if the population is scared enough, and then sometimes you get people get arrested, people get fired from their jobs, and then this is usually sometimes it's enough to scare enough of population into compliance. Yeah. So I mean, this is something that and they see that violence does not work because it's some point, if the government actually applies too much violence, people don't have anything else to lose. They already see that they're being killed on the streets. So what else is there? What else can they do? So
this carnival of yours is going to have some new players. Other people are going to join and say, you know what? They burned the wrong guy in effigy.
I hope that there'll be more actual leadership about around the resistance, because it's. I think that people in the streets actually want to see that their concerns are actually heard, and that the political.
I'm sorry to interrupt because we're running way out of time. I've run over with you, but I have one last question. When people in Europe look at America and they see the protests, what do they think?
To quote Childish Gambino, "This is America." So this is the way democracy is supposed to work. You protest, and then that's something happens. So I think that this is also kind of also hopeful for a lot of people to see that many people are not taking a sit down, and they're resisting, and that they're supporting their community, and they're not buying all this racist stuff that comes out of the administration. And I think that's very comforting, because a lot of Europeans always thought, okay, like, well, America is a democracy. What there's nothing wrong that can happen to this country. And then you see what is happening in the country, and I think that a lot of people are actually taking it pretty personally, and it's pretty scary. Like, who else are going to run to if there's one of the largest democracies in the world, and it's turning into authoritarian, racist nightmare? So what is going to happen to the rest of the world? So I think it's like the developments in the U.S. are pretty important for the rest of the world. A lot of people who hope that that it's not going to happen here.
Yeah. Thank you. Listen, it's always a pleasure. I really appreciate. I love reading your work, and I appreciate the time you spend talking to us here in the Midwest of this big country.
Well, as they say in the Netherlands, sterkte. Be strong.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.